Now that we've learned quite a bit about what contrast is and how to adjust it in Resolve, here are some of the tips that I've learned over the years. I'm going to switch over to shot 43 and load our color transform. And here's what I really like to do when it comes to contrast. Most of the time I'm working under a color transform, and so there's already quite a bit of contrast kind of built in. However, usually it's not quite poppy enough, and we'll want to add a little bit more. So what I'll do is go for the contrast knob and boost that up a little bit until things just feel a little bit more rich. But then we're losing some of these shadows here. And so what sometimes we need to do is grab the pivot and bring it down a little bit so that we're adding more contrast overall, but we're keeping more of the detail in the shadows. Now here's before and here's after. And it kind of just takes away that sort of grayish blush feeling and makes things just feel a little bit more poppy. I feel like that's really nice. The other thing that happens sometimes is if you're up in the contrast in something and it's feeling dark, it might be just because you need to up your exposure a little bit, which I like to do in a node before our contrast. So let's label this contrast and we'll call this one exposure. And in this exposure node, I'll grab my offset and just boost it up a little bit. And this is going to do a similar thing to adjusting my pivot, but it's going to bring the overall level up while keeping that contrast. And depending on your image and kind of what you're going for, that might be a better way to go. The other thing I like to make sure of when it comes to just adding more contrast is I want to go into the project settings and under master settings and under general options, under color, I want to make sure to uncheck use S-curve for contrast. The reason I want to do that is because if we have this on, what Resolve's going to do when we add contrast is kind of map the colors in sort of an S-curve like this, which might look fine, but I kind of want to be in control of that. I don't really want Resolve to do that under the hood without showing me. So now really what we're doing when we up this contrast is we're doing something sort of like this instead of having an S-curve like this. What's the advantage of using the contrast knob versus the curves? Well, the big advantage is just that it's quick and it's one control, right? So if I reset this, I can boost my contrast up and play with my pivot if I need to and get things dialed in by just grabbing two sliders instead of moving this around, moving this where it needs to be, and kind of messing with this a little bit more. It's also really easy if I have my contrast turned up and I want to turn it down a little bit to just kind of take it and turn it down with one adjustment. Whereas if I had this set up in our curves, I would have to make two adjustments and then probably adjust after that. So it's more of a speed thing. Even though you have more control in the curves, it's nice for kind of basic contrast just to use the contrast knob. Now, if you're doing something like building a specific kind of creative look, which we'll get into in a little while, I do like the curves because it gives you so much control. So if we want a really specific kind of roll off in our highlights or our shadows, we can really get detailed with our curve and dial in kind of every part of our shot if we want to. But this is something where you're getting a lot more creative than kind of just fixing a problem of low contrast. So it really depends on what you're doing. But those are the major ways that I would adjust contrast, is just with the contrast knob, maybe play with the pivot, and make sure that I'm dialing in my exposure in a node previous to the contrast node.